Good afternoon and a warm welcome to webinar 5 in the Talking Business During Crisis series. My name's Cameron Brooks and I'm a Senior Learning Consultant at the Melbourne Business School. And I'm pleased to host today's conversation on how organisations can survive now and thrive later. Today's webinar is part 2 in our mini-series where last week in part 1 we focused on the role of purpose. For those of you who were not able to attend, you can view the recording of last week's conversation on the MBS website under the Past Events tab. Over the next hour, we'll be shifting our focus today to discuss the leadership factor in strategy and change. I'd like to begin by explaining how our webinar will run and including how you can be involved. I'll shortly introduce our speakers who will spend approximately 40 minutes discussing their experience of working with organisations going through change and the role of leadership before coming to your questions. So if you have a question, please submit this at any stage during our conversation using the Q&A function, and please refrain from using the raise your hand tool. If you see a question submitted that you'd also like answered, you can upvote this by pressing the thumbs up button. So you'll see that in the Q&A tool as well. I'll be monitoring your questions and we'll attempt to get to as many of those as we can towards the end of our session. At the conclusion of our webinar today, you'll also be redirected to take a short survey, and your feedback will enable us to continue to develop these programs. So in conversation today, we have 3 members of the MBS faculty, including Professor Jeff Martin, Associate Professor Jen Overbeck, and Senior Learning Consultant Neil Middleton. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. So Jeff, I might start with you. Last week, you spoke about the critical role of strategy being guided by purpose and values, and that this was particularly important during times of crisis. Why is this, and what's the role of leadership in this process?
Well, last week we spoke about how during a crisis, empowerment and decentralised decision-making happens by default. There's so many mini crises going on throughout an organisation, and a lot of fast decisions are necessary. So your landlord wants to renegotiate, your supply chain partner's gone broke. There's a rapidly changing external landscape and we need to make decisions about where we might experiment. So lots of decisions need to be made, and a lot of decisions will be made unobserved by the leaders. So last week we were talking about how we can provide some kind of guidance for those decisions so that they're taking place within an overarching framework. We are all pulling in the same direction. We do all have the same purpose. So we were talking about how to provide those simple decision-making rules. So we get out of the way, we provide some top-down leadership. And one way to provide simple decision-making rules and some clarity about what's important is a statement of purpose. The other lever that we spoke about, or the other way to provide guidance, is a clear set of values. And those values provide the boundaries around how we will behave when we make those decisions. So there we're trying to manage reputational risk and make sure that decisions are made consistent with our brand and in ways that manage reputational risk.
So when we talk about leadership in the context of purpose like this, how is that different from leadership as usual? Jen, what's your view on this?
Unmuting. So I think there are 2 key things. The first is that leadership becomes even more important when we want to manage our businesses toward purpose. Purpose is all about the why. And leaders need to get people on board and aligned behind that why with clear vision, clear communication, and then leading by example so the purpose doesn't look like self-interested window dressing. And second, leadership really has to be done in a more intelligent way than we often see. So a lot of times business as usual gives us the opportunity to fly by the seat of our pants a little bit, in a way that is more forgiving potentially of mistakes or misalignment. When we're leading for purpose, there's a phrase that a good friend of mine, Deb Grunfeld, likes to use, which is the most important person in the scene is never you. And that gets to the idea, it comes from acting. It gets to the idea that, you know, we tend to live within ourselves, to think about what our goals are, what we're thinking, what we want to accomplish, and to see other people around us as kind of objects in the environment to be moved around so that things happen the way we want. But to lead for purpose, even more than usual, I think, requires realigning that thinking so that instead of moving objects around, we become very attuned to what are the skills, the capabilities, the interests, the concerns of other people? How do they fit into the purpose? And how do I, as a leader, maximize and enable their ability to contribute to that purpose? I won't be able to do it all myself. I won't be able to simply command and by fiat purpose gets achieved. So I need everybody to be aligned. That means I need to be even more attuned and responsive to the people I work with.
Thanks, Jen. So Neil, in your experience in working with organisations going through change, how then is important in creating an environment of trust, and how do leaders influence this?
I think it's essential, Cameron. The trust is, for me, is one of those foundational pieces of organisational success. If you think about, and for any of you, if you think about your relationships and the most important relationships in your life, trust is probably at the core of that. And trust enables us to really be ourselves and to step into having a go. And particularly, I'm thinking at the moment, in the way things have been, we're stepping into a new space, often a novel space where it's unknown. And we have to have a try. We have to have a go. We have to be vulnerable. And trust is absolutely essential from those around us, but particularly those in leadership roles, to say, look, it's okay. Have a go, try it out, see what happens. Mistakes will happen, but let's learn from them. And it's being able to model that trust so that others, and it's picking up on the word you used, Jen, that there's no fear in the system, there's no fear around people, so that they are willing to stretch and are willing to potentially take risks that they wouldn't normally take.
So as I think about the things that you've all shared, they sound like things that I would say good leaders should be doing at all times. You know, is there something particular about this particular time and the challenges going on in our environment at the moment that mean that some of these things are absolutely critical or different? Does anyone have a view on that?
I'll make a comment on that. I think one of the things that we've seen that's been quite different is that the communication flows in organizations as we've been working from home have really changed in a lot of ways. Not just because we're working from home and we're doing Zoom meetings, but also because so many organizations have had to deal with kind of critical emergency situations. You know, how do we develop ways of servicing our customers when we're not able to go visit our customers and be in their workspace the way we ordinarily would? Or, you know, how do we develop a market and convince people to buy our products when they're in a different space, both with their businesses and personally? So there's been, I think, a lot of kind of all hands effort that's happened, as Jeff referred to at the beginning. That has meant some different lines of sight. So our colleague Carol Gill at MBS wrote a great piece for AFR recently where she talked about the importance of clear lines of sight. I think people have had the opportunity to see what colleagues across organizations are doing in a more vivid way sometimes than maybe they had in the past, which is ironic because here we are farther apart. And yet something about the electronic communication and unusual ad hoc teamwork that many organizations have been involved in has meant a greater sense of exposure to other people. So I would consider that actually an enabling factor that's emerged from the crisis, something that's been different. And yes, it's something we should have done all along, but circumstances didn't always facilitate that. And so it's something we could choose to carry through as we move forward, or if we operated by default, we might not realize that we let it go by the wayside. So I would urge organizations to be really conscious and urge leaders to be really conscious of look for some of those benefits that the situation has provided and try to keep those going.
Yeah, thanks, Jen.
I think the trust has increased as well around realizing that people live whole lives as well. That we see each other on these Zoom calls or whichever technology we're using, and things happen. The door opens and one of the kids walks in. The dog barks. there's a greater tolerance for accepting that that's how life is, and people have to cope with a whole range of things, particularly in the last few months. That's been the case. But we're still able to get our work done. We're still able to produce results. We're still able to talk to those customers. We're still able to collaborate together. So I think, and my hope is that this has increased the levels of trust. Now, the trust can't come without capability either. So as a leader, you can't just go blindly into trusting people. I think there has to be the capability there, and recognize that potentially you have a role as a coach as well in helping people. And sometimes that coaching role leads to the more compassionate side about understanding where people are and what's going on in their lives. And other times it can be much more technical coaching about how we're going to deal with this task, how we're going to get this accomplished within this time frame or within this budget. So, but it is recognizing that leadership has a coaching role in this space as well.
Neil, do you see that the role of trust then also plays through coming back then into the development of the strategy process and how people maybe embody the elements of purpose in the way that they work with that?
I think so. And the strategy process, and Jeff can talk more to this as well, but the strategy process is broad, I think. And the more people you can have in the conversation, the more effectively it can be disseminated. I'm thinking of some of the work that you and I did recently, Cameron, with an organization, and they'd been going through their strategy process. They'd set up their pillars, and they put several months of work into this. But we were getting a sense of some superficial compliance and some murmurings that things weren't quite right. And in working with that team over several sessions, it was good to see how the trust built between those senior leaders, to the point where I remember we were sitting with them and we introduced an activity called We Pretend. And it was gratifying to see this group of leaders lean into the idea of pretense. And I think most organizations have a level of pretense in them. We pretend things are okay, or we go along with things. And they stepped into it and actually went, no, actually, one of these strategic pillars we have, we're not really like that because we tend to do A over B. So maybe we're pretending about that. And that opened up the conversation then. And people were genuinely able to express their opinions and their perspectives in a safe way. Nobody felt that there was going to be any retribution. So I think it was very important to take the time and for that group, and credit to that group for stepping in and being vulnerable. That, I think, is improving their strategic response.
Yeah, no, I recall that session, and it was that building the psychological safety where people could actually talk openly and honestly about what they really believed was going on in the organisation. The strategy on one hand, and that was being promoted, but what people believed inside and their willingness to actually share some of those things was critical.
Yeah. Can I jump in on that topic? One of my PhD students, Josh Hodge, is doing some work on conflict and how conflict happens in groups and teams. And he's hit on something that seems really interesting, which is a lot of times what causes people to respond negatively to others, to colleagues in the workplace, and to experience a sense of conflict and thus a lowering of trust is that they feel that someone has let them down in terms of what should happen. It's a concept called meaning violation. So, we all construct meaning around how people should behave and how we should treat each other, what it's okay to talk about, what it's not okay to talk about. And if you think somebody should, for example, reach out in advance if they're going to miss a deadline, then you would be upset with them if they didn't do that. On the other hand, maybe that employee feels like, well, if I tell you I might not miss the deadline, you might form a negative impression of me, and then I could make the deadline. And why did I bother having you think worse of me if I was just going to make it anyway? And so they don't want to tell you, but then if they miss the deadline, then you feel like, well, you should have told me, and now there's a conflict. So these shoulds are really important in terms of predicting how people are going to respond to each other. But very often those shoulds are implicit. They're not things that we talk about. They may not even be things that we think about or really have access to. So to tie this back to purpose, if an organization is led by purpose, then we really all develop a collective sense of how we should behave, right? Google once had the purpose, don't be evil, or at least a purpose, don't be evil. And they started to move away from that. And that created a lot of very vocal opposition and debate among their employees. So I think, to go back to what Neil is saying and the exercise that the two of you did around pretending, I think another thing that managers can do that's very tangible is to try to raise conversations about shoulds in the workplace. What are the ways that we think we should treat each other? If we're communicating in an emergency, what should we do? I think the crisis has meant that we've all been willing to suspend our shoulds. The should about separating work and home, shoulds about interruptions when we're having conversations. You know, lots of things have been okay. As we move back to a more predictable workplace, a lot of those shoulds, I think, are going to reemerge, and we're going to start to reinforce them. So starting to have some conversations right now about what should we be doing, both on a micro sense and then in terms of the strategy and in terms of the purpose, I think could be very helpful.
Yeah, right. I mean, you know, that word should sort of sounds like it's getting to the heart of, you know, creating a shared culture around what we believe is the way that we should operate.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
And culture being something that we do. So these are behavioural boundaries. And just coming back to, I guess, my opening comments. So the organisations that had done the work on this in the lead up to the crisis, it goes back to Warren Buffett's comment that when the tide goes out, we know who's gone swimming naked. So if you had a really clear set of values that were defining how we interact as an organisation, and that those values, so values defined broadly as what's important to us, how we prioritise, which is then reflected in the purpose, because the purpose tells us which stakeholders are most important to us, which reflects our values. So if you've done that work and you know who you are as an organisation, the guide rails were already in place. Now, I think what you're seeing during this period is there's a lot of organisations stopping and saying, right, where to play. So what should our strategy be in terms of what markets we participate in, what products we sell? Now that's guided by a set of values as well. So before we go back to those really big strategy decisions of where to play and how to win, we need to have a stronger sense of, well, okay, why do we exist again? So what boundaries do we have around what customers we would accept, given our values, what supply chain partners we will engage with. So all of those really big where to play and how to win decisions are driven by a sense of purpose, what we prioritise, who we are as an organisation. I've just seen some really good examples of this in the past, say 6 months, just working with some clients on how to do this. And to Jen's point around the shoulds, asking questions like, so what behaviours are acceptable around here and what aren't? And so there we go away and write a list of what's above the line and what's below the line. And we keep reminding people of behaviours and choices that do reflect our values, so they're brought to life. And another way of doing that brings in more of an emotive hook is that question of, well, what are we proud of about the way we work and who we are? And that really does surface a sense of values, which then provides the guidance in terms of the red lines around how we deal with customers, suppliers, landlords, whoever, as we desperately scramble to save cash during this period and ultimately survive, but with the relationships intact such that we prosper in the long run.
Hey, Jeff, I have a question for you, actually, if that's okay. One of the things that I'm seeing right now, this isn't a COVID crisis as much, but with there's been a slight crisis situation created for a lot of businesses by the Black Lives Matter movement. And a lot of businesses have tried to start expressing values around inclusion and diversity. And, you know, we've seen some pushback, I think, from the market around when that seems relatively less sincere. So it makes me wonder about when companies are trying to live by values, but it's not always the easiest thing to bring that throughout the organization. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so really good question, Jen. And so the leadership team need to really own and personify those values. Otherwise, they go nowhere. And it's interesting how, so I can think of a couple of organisations I work with where they've got the communication rhythm such that the CEO talks to the whole organisation once a fortnight in one case. In the other case, it's weekly for 15 minutes. And if you heard that CEO talk say on 3 or 4 of their conversations, and I said to you, what do you think the 3 or 4 values of that organisation are? I reckon you'd probably nail it. So if the communication and behaviours of the leadership team exhibit a set of values and reflect a clear set of prioritisations, let's say it's customer first, or we respect and embrace diversity, those kind of themes, it's really got to show up in the stuff we do on a day-to-day basis. And it's particularly evident when the values cost you something in terms of the dollars and cents. So the CEO might say, well, we chose not to accept that client because of the fact that they just didn't sit with this set of values. It cost us X million dollars, but we just didn't go there. And that's the kind of leadership that you'd like to see more of, particularly from, say, a Mark Zuckerberg.
It speaks to me of authenticity. Of authenticity of brand, authenticity of leadership, of a leadership team, but also the individual and how the individual is showing up. For me, authenticity and trust go together. That if I see someone, walking their words, and they're aligned in their values, my trust builds in them. Authenticity for me is a key part of trust.
Given the in our current environment, I know people are starting to return to work, but people are working in a far more dispersed way. How do leaders then demonstrate that authenticity and build that trust when perhaps they're not connected in a way that they're traditionally used to being connected to their staff?
Mm.
So there's, I think some of the key dynamics around trust are people often feel like, I don't know, that they need to trust other people before they can make themselves vulnerable. But what the research shows actually is that being vulnerable causes you to trust other people, that it's that vulnerability that requires trust of you, and that sort of forces you to extend trust. So I think this works both ways, but my favorite advice for leaders who are trying to develop both their subordinates' trust in them and also their trust in subordinates is to start by making yourself vulnerable. And you can do that by revealing something about yourself. So another thing that we know from a lot of research on hierarchies is that more powerful people don't like to self-disclose. They like to keep everything sort of held in, more professional, keep everything on a task footing. And lower power people tend to disclose more because they want to build a relationship and they want the boss to understand who they are and maybe treat them a little better. And that's a very one-sided relationship. It also makes trust difficult because you don't really have a bond of mutual understanding. So leaders can start just having conversations, and in those conversations, make it a point to self-disclose. Here's what I'm dealing with. And the remote situation that many of us are still in might give us a great opportunity to do that, because for one thing, right now we have backgrounds on, but often you're seeing somebody's home. So there are cues. You can put little signs of who you are into the scene so that your workers aren't just seeing a white wall or a bookshelf, but they're seeing some artifacts that say something about you. And you can have a conversation that's personal before you get into the business. You can even engineer these conversations. Talk about things. If you'd like to keep it more task focused, you can talk about what makes you most excited. What are you most proud of in your job? What got you into this line of work? Why are you working in a business school, for the three of you? And what brought me to that role? And so that can facilitate some conversations that get the ball rolling.
And Jen, is that a piece about transparency? I guess it's being transparent about the decisions that they're making on a day-to-day basis and explaining what set of values or what is it about them that drove them to go that direction, as in take the organisation in a particular direction or choose to go into a particular market.
Yeah, I mean, that's super important. And I bet Neil would have more to say about this too, but just briefly, I'll say, I think that operational transparency around decisions and strategy is incredibly important. But I also think that leaders often jump to transparency and assume that that will create trust. And the transparency alone, without a fundamental underlying relationship between the leader and the rest of the team, I think that even transparent leaders can be subject to suspicion and cynicism when there's not that strong foundation. So I think it's important to do both. I think both are really key, but I bet Neil has more to say about that.
I think I agree. And I think there's the personal side, the relationship side of it, so that the transparency can be made up of the showing a level of caring, a level of empathy with others. But you also have to be credible. So you have to be you have to be seen to be good at what you do, and that your decision making is fair, and that you take an account, that you're making informed decisions, that you're including others where you need to, but also that you're willing to take accountability in the end, because you can create openness and transparency and inclusiveness, because we know that that's important to get a diversity of views and bring different perspectives in. You know, we're scanning, we're taking in the information, but ultimately a decision has to be made, and you have to be willing as the leader to step into that. And that's part of your authenticity as well, I believe, is being willing to be accountable for that. I think there's another important aspect to this as well, which is something we work on and something we promote very strongly in the work we do, and that's reflection. Reflection in the cause of self-awareness. Because starting, where do I start? And this goes to the point you made, Jen, I think, which is, how do I feel about trust? How do I feel about trusting other people? And the evidence would suggest that we can be in different places with this, and that we may have a kind of basic level individually that I'm either over trusting or I'm under trusting. And what we're looking for is getting it just right. The self-reflection is important to think, why do I hold the position I hold? What has led to that? And is it still true for me? Some years ago, I was doing some work with prison warders, and they recognized that they, compared to some of their colleagues in other roles, they were not as naturally trusting. And when we unpacked that and we explored it, they said it was because of the environment they'd grown up in and that they'd been exposed to for long periods of time. And that didn't have to be true in all of their life circumstances. So by reflecting on it, they were able to say, yes, in some places it's a very valid position to be in, but in other options, it's not going to serve me well, and it's not going to serve my team well. So I think there's a deep piece about self-awareness and where you're coming from and why.
It's interesting. I'm a former auditor, Neil, and I was trained not to trust anyone either.
Time and place.
Well, we're joined on the line by close to 100 participants today. So perhaps I'd be interested in getting your views about your experience of trust in your leaders, perhaps in your organisation. So I'm going to ask you to reflect on a poll that Danielle is going to put onto your screen in a moment, about what's your experience of trust in your leaders been like in your organisation. Then a second question, how do you think employee engagement has perhaps changed or been influenced during that period, and is there a correlation? So I can see the scores coming in now. And thank you, Sanjeev, for posting a question. And while we're waiting on the poll results to come in, please do post any questions that you've got for our panellists today, or upvote somebody's question if you'd like to know the answer as well. So please make use of that with the Q&A function. All right, so we've got those poll results shared on the screen right now. What do you make of them? Well,
it's good to see that during these difficult times, that the feelings of trust have increased and that employee engagement and commitment has increased.
I am quite curious, of course, about the 16 to 20% of the group who feel like those things have gone down.
Yeah.
And if I would certainly encourage if any of you have ways to frame your experiences into a question that we could address, that would be great. I think that would be very useful. You know, there's no doubt that some organizations have been better than others at rising to the challenge of this time. You know, I think that the situation with COVID, both the necessity of being very nimble in crisis situations, and then also having to adapt to a different way of working and leading from a distance, perhaps, that has been a big challenge for managers who are most comfortable both giving orders, looking over people's shoulders, really monitoring what people are doing, using kind of a management by objectives approach. I think that, you know, that's been quite challenging for them. And I'm curious to know if some of these more negative outcomes have been in contexts where maybe the adaptation has been a little bit less fluid.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to drill down on the characteristics of those leaders who have built greater trust during this period. Were there leadership education interventions, for instance? To what extent had they experienced a crisis somewhere in the world previously? Did they have an MBA?
Yeah, I'd really like to unpack these. If we had the opportunity, it would be great to unpack these.
Yeah.
I feel that trust in the senior leaders in my organization has improved. And, you know, why? What are the things that you're observing? What are the things that you're experiencing that lead you to feel that things have improved and equally decreased? What are the things you're experiencing that lead you to that conclusion? And the same with the employee engagement and commitment. There's, you know, it's 53% saying improved. Why is that? And for each of you who are online today, what are you noticing about yourself? If you feel it's improved for you, what has improved? What's leading to this decrease and stayed about the same as well?
I know a client that I was working with used the quote recently in his organisation. He said, while there's been, you know, some really downsides of this, you should never let a good crisis go to waste. And I suppose it lends itself to that. You know, it can be a real catalyst for change.
I was just going to mention that there's this very famous study among psychologists about. Well, so there's a long suspension bridge in Washington State in the US, and it's a very, very scary long bridge that sways in the middle, and people go across it, and it's, you know, it's one of those kind of spooky situations where you feel quite nervous when you're crossing and very relieved to get to the other side. And the researchers engineered situations where people who were crossing the bridge had a conversation with somebody of the opposite sex while they were on the bridge, and then asked them how attractive was that person and how much would you like to go out with them once they got to the other side. And they found that the scary, and they compared this, by the way, to people who met somebody on just a very standard concrete stable bridge that wouldn't scare you at all. And the people who were on the scary swaying bridge were much more attracted to the people that they talked to, and they found them much more fascinating and looking and that sort of thing. And I think that speaks a bit to the present moment. You know, the way we've all been scrambling, and there's been hardly a moment to breathe, and we've just had to adapt and rush. And it's been scary because people have felt insecurity around their jobs, and we've seen our friends, neighbors, family members lose jobs and be in a very vulnerable position. So there's a lot of that kind of arousal, is the psychological term, happening right now, that can make this a very exciting and stimulating time. And in some ways, I would caution us again to, as we start to return to something that feels more normal, be really aware that we may feel a bit of a crash from that. And it might be that a lot of our positive feelings during this time are tied up in that feeling of you know, frantic purpose and activity, and we need to be really intentional and deliberate about carrying that forward.
So that's maybe a good opportunity to pick up on Sanjeev's question, which I know a number of people have voted on, which says that, do you think, or he asked the question, do you think that organisations and countries with leaders who lead with emotional intelligence, especially showing empathy, will emerge from this crisis stronger?
Well, I think there's a range of attributes of leaders that predict the outcomes during crises and during normal times as well. I think that emotional intelligence needs to sit with a lot of other virtues in order for it to be able to build that trust and build the relationship such that you come out the other end stronger. So a great article in the Harvard Business Review, the most recent one, where there's a famous psychologist who's spent a lot of time working with the attribute of courage. And he was demonstrating how, in his research, just how important courage was to sit alongside any other emotional attributes such as EQ in order to deal with that adverse situation. So I would say EQ is definitely one of the factors that you need to have there. But in order to predict how a leader is going to bring their organisation through it, you've got to have a look at a lot of other personality attributes, values attributes, formal education and training.
I would add, I don't think it's just the leader's EQ that matters. In fact, more important might be the EQ of the team, or the average EQ of teams in the organization. So a few years ago, a study came out looking at what makes teams most effective. And in particular, there's a kind of a team intelligence that we can look at, how well the team can work together and solve problems and how smart they are as a team. And one of the chief predictors of that team intelligence was the emotional intelligence or social intelligence of the people who are on the team. And so even if you have a leader who lacks some emotional intelligence, if you have a team carrying things out and that team itself has very high emotional intelligence, they may be able to compensate for some of those gaps that the leader has.
I think that's really, on the team point, I think it's important that that team also has diversity of personality and diversity of experience, diversity of education, which is going to enrich it. But it does have to have a common emotional intelligence as well, or common level of emotional intelligence, so that it can compensate for the different characters in the team and how they might react to different circumstances. Something might trigger someone, which could, in an emotionally unintelligent space, trigger everyone and it all blows up. Or if there's emotional intelligence sufficiently operating in that group, someone triggers, somebody else can step in and say, what's going on for you? Help us to understand. Or can actually respond in a way that can capitalize on what's just happened and help the team learn from it. So I agree with that. The mix is really important.
Mm-hmm.
So Anna's asked the question whether or not the errors that leaders might make during this time, whether they're more likely to be easily forgiven, and whether anyone has an opinion on that.
I think it's a procedural justice issue, as in if they can see that the decisions were made based on a set of values that they were happy with and was consistent with the messaging around what our purpose is and why we exist, and it was made on the best information at the time, everyone was happy with it at the time, well, we made that decision under uncertainty, it didn't work out. Whereas if a decision was made and it was not seen as consistent with who we are as an organisation, we might have gone with a client or burnt a client or burnt a landlord, and it really created disengagement, and that led to organisational failure. That's when it's not forgiven.
I also think people make pretty good allowances for situations. We can see this with some of the government decisions that have been made during this time. Like, for example, when the supermarkets were having trouble stocking enough toilet paper or other goods that people were buying in shocking amounts. One of the responses of local government was to relax controls and regulations around the hours in which stores could be stocked so that trucks could come in and restock stores more frequently so that stock would be available. And I think the idea is, there's not always just a blind trust that organizations will conduct themselves in a way that the neighborhood, for example, prefers. But in a time where there are exigent circumstances, we'll relax the rules and we'll say, look, you're going to just need to do what you need to do. I think that's been extended to leaders. And we've said, you're dealing with a very difficult situation. You need to do whatever you need to do. We'll be more forgiving, and then we'll deal with the consequences later. So I think that her perception is correct there.
Yeah,
I think
I also think there's
tolerance increases.
Yeah, I was going to say, I also think there's a perspective on what I call the goodwill bank, and the degree to which leaders have invested in building that goodwill, and that will go back to your point, Jeff and Neil, about the way in which they've led consistently with purpose and values. And even if you notice the amount of positive or constructive feedback leaders have given, it's much easier then for leaders to provide perhaps some more critical feedback if you've invested in that goodwill bank, you've established that trust. So I think, people's tolerance for accepting mistakes will depend upon whether you're in deficit or whether you're in the positive in relation to that as well.
Yeah.
So Magda's asked, it's often challenging for leaders to relinquish control, and some appear to be resentful of employees working from home the entire time when that was not the pre-COVID arrangement. What advice or strategies would you have for leaders to develop a more trusting relationship with their employees?
I'll tackle that one from the perspective of the employee. I can't tell if Magda is asking about how to address this with the leaders themselves, or how to address it from the perspective of an employee dealing with a leader. So I'll do the latter. I think, a big thing is to be more transparent upward. So leaders are accustomed, as I said, to monitoring, particularly less trusting leaders. They often substitute for trust with monitoring and surveillance of employees, and really, I don't trust you, so I'm just going to confirm for myself everything about what you're doing. So I think initiating more disclosure, using things like some maybe shared calendars, shared task lists that the leader can access to see what it is that you're working on, giving little updates. It may seem self-promoting in some ways, particularly for women, to send emails saying, hey, I finished this project. Hey, I achieved this contact that we wanted to make with this other organization. And yet that's the kind of thing that can be very reassuring for a leader who has low trust in people. So one thing is to simply disclose some of those things so the leader's really reassured that work is happening. I also think initiating a conversation about defining, what are your goals for my job? What is the most important priority that you want me to be focused on? And what would be things that would make you more and less comfortable with the work I'm doing? And so really just getting a sense of alignment so that the leader can have confidence in that. And then instead of maybe touching base on every little thing that you do, you can instead just update the person on the things that you've agreed are key areas of focus.
I think it can also be a piece about working with the network of contacts. So it may not be just I completely agree with what you just said, Jen, and it's building on that so that you're actually in contact with a broader range of people as well, so that the group is informed, or key contacts within your group, key stakeholders are informed, and there is a level of comfort in the actions you're taking, the results you're achieving, the outcomes you're achieving, and that you can actually relay that back through your network so that potentially your boss can turn to anyone and get a consistent message coming across.
I might come to this question, and it says where somebody's actually shared that trust in their organisation has decreased, and they said it's a smaller office and an older cohort that did not translate usual ways to engage in a digital format. The leader has to provide more frequent updates on the state of the organisation in certain times. Do you have any thoughts on how to build back that trust and engagement if it's been lost?
Well, initially it would be a process of admitting previous mistakes and a credible commitment to doing things differently in the future. And unfortunately, I'd suggest if they've got themselves in that situation, I'd struggle to believe that they can do that. But that's what it'd take to stop and say, right, we got things wrong. Here's what we did wrong. Here's the path to correct.
Another thing that speaks to me in this question is the older cohort. It suggests a group that was a little bit blindsided by the situation and maybe not fully equipped to deal with the technological demands in addition to the work style demands that COVID presented. And what you would find in that situation, in addition to those kinds of capability gaps, is probably a lot of emotional hesitation and concern. People might feel that their very value is on the line because they're aware that they're having difficulty in the situation and they're not as nimbly, whoop, it disappeared. They're not as nimbly able to keep up with younger colleagues or colleagues in other organizations. So one role of leadership, and even actually of other coworkers in that case, can be to help bolster the feelings of value, status, respect that these workers have, to help to reinforce the things that they are capable of and that they can contribute. And if possible, even shift around workflows so that that's leverage. But if it's not possible, then at least to be providing reassurance so that feeling of vulnerability that they're having doesn't become an additional burden on their capacity to adapt.
One approach may be to also, excuse me if there's a dog barking in the background, can be that to review what we've learned and start with the review based on maybe some of the technical aspects of the work rather than the relational aspects, but working on what have we learned, what targets were we able to achieve, which did we miss and why, what technologies, what systems, what processes, what worked well, and if this were to happen again, what would we do differently? And then you could gradually move to potentially, and how did we feel about going through this? What have we learned about ourselves? And so you can build some comfort into having the conversations about the experience from a technical point of view, but then the experience from a personal point of view, and then from an interpersonal point of view, and the dynamic that's starting to show up that we would have to work on to be more successful in future.
I'm going to pick up on Jocelyn's question, which relates to diversity and inclusion, and it relates, Jen, to your earlier observation about this crisis has been overlaid with the Black Lives Matter movement that has also arisen. And Jocelyn asks, does the panel think that diversity and inclusion in the workplace will improve as a result of the crisis, or will the crisis provide an opportunity for some organisations to actually step back from some of those commitments?
If you saw my expression then, like that was a meaning, I hope not, to the latter. And I really hope that we can see the value, the greater value that the diversity, the inclusion, the bringing the different perspectives, opinions, ways of being into the workplace can enrich the information we have, can enrich the creativity, the innovation, and what we're able to create together. So I really hope that it is the former rather than the latter.
I know my own personal view on this is I would hope that actually organisations have seen that some of the mindsets that they held prior to the crisis have actually been challenged. The notion that actually people working outside of office hours, outside of the office, will still be productive might be one that's been challenged. And in fact that, that traditional notion of, women being the caregiver and the husband goes to work, turned on its head, and that, males are just equally as capable at helping and working around the house, and doesn't have to be the person who is the one in the office. So I would hope that maybe it's provided an opportunity for people to see perhaps mindsets that might have been held that aren't valid now. Would be perhaps one view that I would hold.
I guess I would see it as an inflection point. I think I think what we might see is those organizations that have risen to the challenge of managing in COVID times generally are probably very well placed to be able to capitalize on this movement toward greater embrace of diversity and inclusion, because it's that kind of adaptive leadership, very attuned leadership, focusing on the quality of work and the degree to which we are achieving our purpose, which is a word we haven't used for a few minutes in the conversation. You know, are we doing the things that get us closer to achieving that purpose, as opposed to, are we putting in hours? Are we staying for a long time? Are we billing a lot? Obviously that's important, but as the only metric. So those organizations that have made that shift, I think those are the same kinds of capacities that serve well for maximizing the benefits of diversity. At the same time, we know a bunch of things. We know women, for all of the fact that we've learned that men can be great caregivers and do a fair share of work at home. In many cases, women have borne a disproportionate amount of the burden at home. We know that government support is hitting women's industries more negatively and being more assistive toward men's industries. I think there's reason to be concerned that on the gender dimension of diversity, that this is going to be risky for women. And in terms of racial diversity and other forms of diversity, I think work from home has some risks involved. And some of those have to do with the fact that when people are far away, we tend to rely on kind of our mental shortcuts. Who's available, who comes to mind first if we think about a project to assign or who to ask about information gathering. And that can mean that people who aren't as much like me get left out. Without a very sensitive and aware manager, then that can mean disadvantage for people who are members of underrepresented minority groups of any type. So I think it's a very, I guess I see good signals and I see really cautionary signals. And I think organizations need to, again, be quite purposeful in the way they deal with diversity right now to make sure that they don't just fall into doing it badly.
Yeah. Which maybe, you know, there's two people have sort of wanted to know about how might you deal with a leader who is actually the antithesis of all of the sorts of things that we've been talking about today, which maybe lends itself to asking a poll to our audience, which is in relation to how equipped do you feel the skills of your leaders are to actually manage through this crisis? So I'd be curious to actually ask that question to our group. Danielle, if you could put that poll up, which is, my organisation has leaders with the skills to navigate this crisis. So the answer scores, that the results are coming in. And you can see those on your screen now. So clearly a number agree, but you know, we've still got close to 8% of our audience who are saying strongly disagree. So it's not consistent. Any last reflections from our panel in relation to building those skills for leaders during this period?
If you think about the combination of skills necessary to be successful in navigating a crisis, there's a lot of the EQ, a lot of the IQ. We need experience in leadership roles, experience in leading through crises. And a lot of us, clearly this is a 1 in 100 year event. So this has pushed the capability boundaries of every leader on the planet. And so I'm not at all surprised that there's a relatively low proportion who have the skills to get through it. Now, what this is really hopefully a catalyst for is to stop and say, well, okay, what are the key success factors for a great leader, regardless of crisis or not? Let's sit down, go through it, map out a plan, or map out a leadership and development, a learning and development plan to get the mid-tier as well as the senior tier of leaders up to scratch so that we're ready for the next one. And by the way, these skills will be incredibly valuable in the interim.
think there's a piece here that I have a concern for the coming phase as well, that sometimes when the crisis hits, the response can be more obvious. It can be quickly adjust to manage the situation, to calm the situation. It's almost triage. And we've gone through that. It's been lasting for a number of months. We've moved into what some people have called the new normal, the next normal. My concern is for what's next, because this is going to go on. And the skills of responding to the immediate crisis have to change slightly. The way leaders respond to the coming events of some economic circumstances, this is still going to challenge us, but also the circumstances where people have, and it goes to your point earlier, Jen, it's almost like coming down off that high, the excitement, the arousal. And managers and leaders are going to have to be able to deal with their team members as the emotions change, as the response changes, to keep people aligned, to keep people on track, to stay connected to a sense of purpose and a sense of direction. So I think the skill set is going to be called on in a slightly different way going forward.
And I guess my comment about these leaders who don't seem to have this capacity, from research that's been done on people's kind of innate ideas about leadership and their tendencies toward leadership, I think it's really only about 10% of leaders who are just unsalvageable. And that's high. I mean, it'd be nice if it were lower than that. Our percentage is a little lower than that, so that's great. About 10% of leaders just have this view of leadership that it's about dominating people and it's about grabbing what they can get, and they don't trust anybody and they're not going to trust anybody. And there's not a lot of evidence that they can be helped to rethink that attitude. But there's another maybe 20% of leaders that have these kinds of behaviors that don't seem very adaptable, that don't seem ready to relinquish tight control to people. They don't trust very easily. And what we find with these leaders frequently is that that's driven by their own sense of insecurity or doubts about their own competence, their capability to meet the demands that arise, or their suspicion that people don't really respect them. And so I think those kinds of challenges can really be effectively dealt with, particularly if you can join together with others in the organization to do sort of a 360 support system for that leader. You know, they need help in developing their tangible skills. They need to develop more competence so that they understand that they can deal with the challenges. And then they also, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, might need some reassurance. They might need a little extra expression of respect. They might need to know when their work is appreciated. And that can be hard to do because they can be making it really difficult for people and distancing people at the same time as what they really need is some reassurance. But if you keep that in mind, you kind of take a compassionate view toward these kinds of leaders, start with the assumption that they're still savable, and try to support and work with them and forgive some of their offenses as like a puppy getting into the rubbish, but really still wanting to be approved of. Then those little changes in your own mindset can both help you cope and might be able to help that leader make some progress as well.
Thanks, Jen. And just on the basis that we haven't answered everybody's question, sort of says that, you know, we could go on a lot longer with the conversation than we have time for. So we will bring it to a conclusion now, but we have on our website answered some of the previous questions that were unanswered, and we'll endeavour to do the same with the questions that we didn't get to. So I'd like to say thank you to Jeff, Neil and Jen for joining today, but I'd also like to say thank you to our over 90 people who joined us on the session today. If you enjoyed this session, I would like to suggest topics for the future webinars that we'd have. We'd really welcome your feedback. So there's a link to a brief survey that will be with you shortly. I mentioned at the beginning of the event, today's discussion is webinar 2 in a 2-part series. And for those of you who weren't able to attend last week, the recording is available on the NBS website if you'd like to view it. Coming up, we also have our monthly Talking Data series with special guest Professor Steve Tadelis from the UC Berkeley Haas School of Business, and that will be on the 25th of this month. And join my colleague Greg Harbidge, who's going to be speaking to Ofer Yom Tov, who is the Chief Design Officer at the ANZ, and they will explore how to champion human-centred design. And for more information on all of our events and registration links, they'll be available on the MBS website. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you back online again shortly. Thanks for joining us today.